I can probably project my voice into this small room, but we're using the microphones because the session is also being live streamed. First, I would like to encourage everyone just to come fill these empty seats. So if you are sitting on the outside and do have things to say, please come sit down. Thank you. So welcome to this breakout session titled Urban Solutions for Urban Futures, Climate and Migration. I would have liked to title it Human Mobility in the Context of Climate Change, but we had a word count limit. So don't feel that this is kind of a limiting thing for our discussion today. My name is Tobias Bernstein, and I'm an advisor at Adelphi, where I work on climate diplomacy and human mobility in the context of climate change. And we had originally conceptualized this session together with representatives from the IOM, with the idea to make sure that also in the context of the BCSC, that migration, and perhaps more broadly, human mobility in the context of climate change is part of the conversation. And two, that the discussion center on urban challenges and opportunities in the global south, as the lion's share of movement is intra-country or intra-regional and rural to urban, with cities dealing with the challenge of development while also managing the influx of persons looking for economic opportunity whose livelihoods often have been impacted by climate change. And 3, to also make sure that the discussion not focus specifically on Africa, also on Africa, but often in Europe, there is kind of just a look only southwards, but also on South and Southeast Asia. So maybe a bit of housekeeping. We'll start with 4 short inputs of a maximum 5 minutes to help set the scene for the discussion afterwards. And we want to have a conversation with everybody here for the rest of the time. So in that discussion part, please do turn on your microphone so the folks listening online can hear you as well. And I'll just go ahead and introduce the speakers one by one as they give their input. So I'd like to start with Dennis Tensler, the Director and Head of Program Climate Policy at Adelphi. Please, Dennis.
Yeah, thank you, Toby, and it's glad to be here in this round with so many experts and at this very important conference. We thought to start with a little bit more information how we are focusing on at the moment on this topic of climate and migration, human mobility in the context of climate change, which is basically a research project funded by Horizon Europe, Habitable. And Habitable, with 22 partners in 18 countries, has been running for 4 years now. It's coming to an end and is, as the name indicates, centered around the notion of habitability. And it aims to formulate a broader and interdisciplinary concept in order to help us a little bit better to understand how and to analyze how environmental disruptions can potentially trigger major social change. And the most, at least from my perspective, one of the most important parts was not to have only like research institutions out there in Europe, but also to really work closely with partners in different countries like Kenya, Ethiopia, Ghana, Mali and Thailand. So we tried, what we have been trying is to do also based on distinct field missions and with other partners like, for example, the Potsdam Institute, to come up with some groundwork in order for Adelphi to guide on the development of scenario narratives, and on the one hand on aspirational ones and then others more determined by crisis trends, and not only to come up with what is normally the typical currency of a research project with journal articles and data sets, but also to what we already have been able to produce and publish, 6 distinct videos on scenario narratives in the different countries. And they were produced by the colleagues in the research institutions, and this is available, and you are welcome to use this, also the QR code later on, of course not right now, but later to have a look. They are not too long, but really try to help us a little bit, and there it's also connected to the urban space to understand how those communities on the ground are perceiving how climate and migration may be or is likely to be related to each other in the future. We have scenarios with a 2030 focus, with a 2050 focus. And I think to introduce this discussion, one point is probably for most of you quite clear. We are also in terms of a future perception. We are not necessarily talking about international migration patterns here, but it's again that those communities first of all try to consider what is going to happen in a rural-urban context as one example, and also starting from a point where it's clear that migration is perceived as an element of adaptation today. And this is working in one or the other context in a way that it ensures at least that families, that local communities are able through, for example, rural-urban migration to get access to better education, also to some alternative income opportunities. It's especially when we look at the example in Ghana, there are references that there's a perception that most likely more family members are going to migrate in the future in order to further stabilize the income opportunities, also to ensure that more members of the families are able to get familiar with new sources of income, but also to come back. I think that is one of the core elements here of this adaptive approach, to try to ensure that there's a diversification of income opportunities, and at the same time there are some profound concerns, in this Ghana example, as one example, that there will be more and more disintegration of the social safety and protection net. Also, that there will be more family members at risk to be considered or to be in a position where they are part of this so-called trapped population. So this is due to also climate changes and some inactions at the government level. There's more reliance on these social safety nets in a way, but also quite some concerns here. So one of the other examples referring to Thailand, and I will then hand over to the next speaker, is that the rural-urban migration in Thailand is also only one option of quite a number of different opportunities. Also, cross-border migration is perceived as one viable option here, given that there are better overall conditions to guide migration, and also to enable, for example, to have more regularized migration. So the Thailand example is maybe also, as final sentence, interesting, because the colleagues there also brought in this overall importance of a vision, like a green transition vision for the overall country, in order to enable that there are more options and entry points for education and alternative income opportunities. So we have a mixed pictures. You're warmly invited to have a look on these videos as another output, and we may come back to some of the policy recommendations linked to this habitable approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis. So Tasnia, please, over to you.
Hello, everyone. I am Tasnia Kondogar-Prova. I am the climate research lead at Brak University, based in Bangladesh. Today, to contextualize the discussion we hope to have, I wanted to sort of paint a picture about not just, broader Bangladesh, but this very important question about rural to urban migration that we see in the country. And as many of you would know, Bangladesh ranks really high in climate vulnerability across the world. And when a country is assigned these tags of climate vulnerability, often there are images assigned to what that vulnerability looks like. And so for us, there were grand images of floods, cyclones, and heavy devastation. And while it is absolutely true that that is the case, when we focus on sudden climate shocks and disasters and coping and immediate risks that it comes with, we also tend to sort of overshadow slow climate changes that in the last 2 years have become more tangible. So much so that when we go to fieldwork and we ask questions, people are talking about extreme heat, people are talking about cold waves, talking about erratic rainfall or the lack of rainfall, more than what the devastation of a recent cyclone had impacted in their lives. And so these are these very nuanced context that needs to be studied, and I think the knowledge that we have needs to constantly be adapted with community members at the ground. Essentially, I want to leave you with two major takeaways. One is we have these climate disasters affecting mostly, outside of metropolitan cities, in the peripheries, where while we have a history of, cultural migration, we are a country of migrants. My father himself is a migrant who moved from a peripheral region to the capital to work. But despite so, the agency that comes with migration is being questioned now. It is often after the third cyclone that a lot of people living in peripheral zones decide that this just cannot be it. We cannot continue to live like this. And so what we see is a lot of internal displacement. Even though some of the peripheral regions border India, there are many reasons why most of the migration tends to be internal and moving towards urban cities within Bangladesh. And the second takeaway is about the urban cities. In Dhaka, where I live, it's one of the largest megacities in the world, one of the most populous megacities in the world, where by 2050, we're going to be a population that exceeds 110 million. And more people coming from peripheral regions often resort to living in informal settlements. A population that has far evaded any statistics and any true numbers we aren't aware. Informal numbers go about 4.4 million people living in informal settlements. And just to paint a picture, these are settlements based out of aluminum tins with no insulation, with no climate responsive structures. So what I have called the harm chain of climate migration is that someone who has struggled their entire lives with floods and cyclones and disasters that we are lucky to not face, move now to urban systems where extreme heat, the urban heat island effect, erratic rainfall, urban flooding has re-victimized them to urban climate impacts, and that harm chain has continued. And this is something that I would like to continue discussing on, and the fact that, just because people have migrated, and yes, a lot of people do see it as an adaptive force, where you migrate to adapt for a better life. Oftentimes, that is not the case. Thank you.
Thank you. And apologies for not introducing you properly, but you did a great job of that yourself. So now we'll hear from Kaylee Ober, the Senior Climate Security Advisor in the U.S. Department of State. Please. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. Thank you, everyone. First, I'd like to say thank you for inviting me to this, and seeing very familiar faces here, it's heartening. You might have seen me speak before in the past, but now that I represent the U.S. government, I'm going to speak on behalf of the U.S. interagency, and so my remarks might seem a little different than usual. But I think it's important to understand where I'm coming from and orient you a bit to sort of how I approach this issue, or how the U.S. government approaches this issue largely. So first, I should say that the Biden-Harris administration is taking climate-related migration very seriously. For those who don't know, in 2021, the White House actually published a report on the implications of climate change on migration. That report makes very clear a number of things. One of that is climate change is affecting migration patterns today and will likely increasingly affect them into the future. Two, migration is a clear adaptation strategy in some cases, especially if the correct type of support is provided. And three, addressing climate-related migration issues requires sort of a whole of government, whole of society approach, right? We need every single sector, from the humanitarian, development, peace building, climate and migration sides, to come together to work on this issue. And it can't be done by the U.S. government alone. It needs to be done in partnership with others. So that document was really meant to lay the groundwork for the U.S. government working more concretely on this issue. It was incredibly aspirational at the time. But I'm happy to report 3 years later, actually, it's been a couple weeks since we marked the 3rd-year anniversary of that report coming out, that a lot of progress has been made. So first, the U.S. government continues to interrogate and explore the implications of climate change on migration in a variety of ways. And here I have to tip my hat to the U.S. Agency for International Development, my colleagues in the back here, for really leading the charge on that, right? There's 2 reports in particular that I really encourage you to read that they put out in 2023. One is on migration as an adaptation strategy, so really interrogating what that means. for USAID and how they can support sort of migration as adaptation in a number of ways. The second is about the challenges and opportunities in urban settings related to climate-related migration, so very pertinent to the conversation we're having today. And again, does a deep dive on sort of what that means for USAID. And different agencies and departments will continue to sort of contextualize what this means for them, but USAID is really leading the way. I want to make that clear. Second, we're really mainstreaming climate migration into different policies and programs where it's relevant. Again, making sure that the migration folks and climate folks are talking to each other in different ways, integrating it in different ways. For instance, the USAID climate strategy from 2022 to 2030 notes that the agency is increasing its focus on climate-related migration through research and analytics, program responses, and attention to migration-affected populations. The Department of State also released a new approach in 2023 that highlights a number of objectives. One, strengthening and expanding the protection of refugees and migrants in situations of vulnerability affected by climate change. Two, enhancing existing climate action by partnering with key humanitarian partners. Three, expanding U.S. multilateral diplomacy and leadership to address the impacts of climate change on migration and displacement. And four, strengthening coordination between agencies to advance policy solutions. And third, I think importantly, we're providing sort of the support needed for increased engagement, programming, and a number of ways. So for instance, in 2022, the U.S. contributed $5 million to the UN's Migration Multi-Partner Trust Fund explicitly to support programs focused on climate-related migration. This contribution has helped fund projects that support labor mobility in the Pacific, address policy and data gaps related to climate displacement in the Horn of Africa, improve the resilience of coastal communities in India, and build the capacity of local leaders in Brazilian border towns in the Amazon region. And that's just a small snippet of the type of support we are providing. And as I said earlier, this can't be done without close partnership with like-minded allies and individuals like yourselves. So I look forward to having this discussion with you and sort of building up and ramping up that work together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kaylee. So finally, we'll hear from Christina Dexel, Senior Policy Advisor at the Federal German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. Christina.
Thanks a lot. I will skip most of my introduction because I think we've heard the important points around this nexus of urban spaces, climate change impacts, and human mobility. So I will aim to give you a bit of a focus from a policy perspective, specifically the German one, with this development focus or development policy focus as well. So where we see that climate change impacts human mobility in a strong way, and our focus when we look at this is to see which groups, what people and what spaces are being most affected or are being most vulnerable to these impacts, and also to the challenge that comes with human mobility in the context of climate change. And that really brings cities in the forefront. We see that they are strongly affected by climate change impacts. You've mentioned many of the important points there. And then also migrants or displaced populations in urban areas are specifically at risk again for those climate change impacts, or might have moved because of climate change impacts in the first place. So we see many interconnections here. From the development policy perspective, our focus really lies, when we look at it from a very broad perspective, on ensuring the dignity of choice of the people most affected. So what does that mean? We want to make sure that people who would prefer to stay in their places of habitation are able to do so in a safe manner. So for that, adaptation in place is important in supporting those groups. But also, if people choose to move, they should be able to do so in a safe manner as well, in a regular manner. So we need regular pathways that are accessible to these people, and that's one big roadblock that I think we as an international community, as different actors around the table, still have a lot to work on, and there is a lot of efforts in that direction as well. So making sure that this choice, and that's something that was mentioned before with the focus on agency that I would like to pick up. I think this is really crucial and at the center here. So now what we have really worked on in the past few years, and that is also in cooperation with partner countries, with other actors and groups, is around making sure that the nexus between climate change and human mobility is worked on, is being put, gets more visibility. And that already, I think we've made quite a bit of progress also in the German policy field. But now we bring in, or this is already a thing that should have that is relevant for a couple of years, but now we need to bring in a new focus, which is this urban space focus. So there's basically, from a policy perspective, it really means to tie in these different fields together, and that is challenging, but that is something that we need to move forward. So to make sure when we work on urban planning, urban development, in our development projects, for example, we also think about issues around human migration, human mobility, migration, displacement, or resettlement, and also, of course, about around climate change impacts. So maybe to give you just one example where we are moving in that direction and making that push, I would like to mention our global program, which is called Human Mobility in the Context of Climate Change. It's being implemented by GIZ, by our development agency, and we just started a second phase. The program has been going on since 2017, but this year we started the second phase. The focus areas regionally will lie on cooperation with Fiji, the Philippines, and West Africa with ECOWAS. And we have made that step to include a focus on urban spaces and on cities and the role of cities in that program. So there we move in the right direction, I hope, and it's something that we're building up now. And I think we also see good or important steps in that direction on a more multilateral level and international level when we look at different city networks and actors in that field. So we see the Global Cities Fund for Migrants and Refugees, for example, now also has a specific funding window for climate change and inclusive climate action. We see the C40 Alliance of Cities and Mayors, and also the Mayors Migration Council and the Mayors Migration Mechanism, who now specifically also focus on climate change issues. And I think the Migration Multi-Partner Trust Fund is another very important example. So I think we see this move to really bring and tie in those different policy fields, which often have been worked on a bit too siloed and too separated in the past. So that's something that we're really focusing on already and also in future. So very much looking forward to the discussion, to hearing from all of you, from other challenges and experiences, or also best practice examples maybe. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So all speakers were on time. It's a miracle. And that means we have lots of time to discuss now. So yeah, I already see someone raising their hand. So please say your name and where you work. And
Smiljana Knesa, I'm Ambassador at Large for Climate Diplomacy from Slovenia. I will have to leave a little bit earlier, so I'm rushing into a question. It was very, very, very interesting and very pertinent what we have heard. But still, we are attending the Climate Security Conference. It was possible to feel the security aspects beneath what has been said. But still, can speakers shed some light into security element of the climate change and forced human mobility nexus? Where climate security comes in, how do you see it? Thank you.
I guess any speaker who wants to jump in, and then maybe also good to take a step back and think about what do we mean when we say security? Is it human security? Yeah. And it doesn't just have to be
human security.
Okay, great. And it just doesn't have to be the speakers. Anyone, please. Yes.
Yeah, Madeleine O'Donnell with the UN Department of Peace Operations. No, I did not wander into the wrong session. But I just wanted to reinforce and maybe add my question on top so that when we turn back to the experts. One example that I've heard of where does the peace dimension come into this issue is that some of the people who, under the dignity of their personal choice, are having to leave these sites. Sometimes those are the actual community leaders who have been managing a lot of local conflicts, particularly around issues such as transhumance. And so people are saying these are locally constructed ways that have effectively managed those conflicts for decades, and yet climate somehow is outpacing their ability to evolve. And that some of the urbanization that we're seeing is actually leaving vacuums in some of the critical local peace-building architecture and human resources that have been managing a lot of these conflicts. But I will, turn to you experts and love to hear, did that come up in your case study, particularly on Mali, and do you have other examples exactly of where this peace dimension might come in? Thank you.
Thank you. مساعد عقلان, senior researcher at Sana Center for Strategic Studies from Yemen. I would like also to share our experience in Yemen because we are facing a lot of problems in terms of immigration. Nowadays we have more than 4.5 million internal migration in Yemen, of which 10% because of climate change. And the problem is the most affected people or immigrants are those who are most vulnerable people who are living in rural areas, depending on agriculture activities. And one of the biggest problem we are facing now, those immigrants are moved to unsafe areas, which is mostly public areas, close to wadis, close to valleys, and nowadays there are thousands of immigrants who moved many times because of floods. Because it's the only areas they can live in is the public areas. The other areas are private. It's not easy to have this for settlements. And now there are, based on statistics, we have more than 58% of these immigrants without basic needs. And maybe the last point I would like to also to mention, most of Yemenis relied on agriculture activities, and because of this immigration and climate change, and also because of the big things we have in Yemen is the conflict, Yemen relied for a long time on indigenous or traditional water systems and agriculture activities. And because of this climate impacts, whether water scarcity or floods or cyclones, which is increasing. Last 6 years, we have 6 cyclones, which happened before in 20 years. Now it happens in only 6 years. Only this last season we have, from July till September, around 40% of agriculture areas are affected, of which around 12% are totally damaged because of floods. So this year is one of the biggest we have faced, and which also lead to more immigrants. Thousands of houses are collapsed, including internal displaced person camps. So this, what I would like to focus on is this traditional techniques are being lost now because of these immigrants from rural areas, which most of people relied for a long time. And this is one of our focus as a research center, is to study how to revive these indigenous water systems, agriculture systems, and to support locals to come back using these systems. And I can assure you without support from the institutions and international partners, we cannot go back to this basic and traditional water and agriculture systems. So this is my contribution regarding to Yemen. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Maybe just to link it back to the peace question, I think a lot of it also then in an urban context has to do then with resource scarcity, and then also two or several groups of people then coming together and being in the same space and having to then manage this kind of challenge. And to maybe move from mostly talking about challenges to also talking about solutions, what do you all see as a way that urban leaders could be better supported in managing the challenges that they face? Yes.
Andrea Dicru from UNAMI in Baghdad. One of the things that we've noticed is, as you just said, these tensions can arise with increased urbanization, but when you dig a bit deeper, the tensions are quite specific. They're about not having access to water and not having access to good places to live and other resources that are needed, which is actually a positive because you can do something about that. And so if we can help with urban design, also funding for what the future will look like in 10 and 15 years, those urban places can be places where people can thrive, and those tensions can be diffused because the needs are being met.
Hello, my name is Sabine Minninger. I'm Senior Policy Advisor on Climate Change with the German development organization Bread for the World, which is based here in Berlin, and I follow the UNFCCC process, especially the setup of the new Loss and Damage Fund. So I wonder now, asking the US and the German government, what potential do you see that the new setup of the Loss and Damage Fund actually has the scope on addressing climate-induced migration and displacement? So far, the fund is there, which is fantastic, and it brings a bit more justice to the people who added zero to the problem. But the fund needs to be filled, and that will be like a big issue now at the COP29 in Baku. And I wonder, what potential do you see to address these issues and to bring justice to the people? Thank you.
So maybe I'll give Christina and Kaylee a moment to chew on that, and then I'll come back to you after the next input. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Matti Lehtonen with the Climate Security Mechanism based in New York and representing UNEP in that multi-agency mechanism. I had the pleasure of working with Central America a little bit on these themes and then studying more on the prevention of involuntary displacement, but there was more space in thinking about where do these people go and where do they end up, which is cities and which is urban. And I think the connection to peace and security is that they do often, these low-skilled people who end up more in the outskirts of informal places and peri-urban areas where they are more vulnerable both to climate impacts but also then to recruitment to illicit livelihoods, violence, and in some cases extremism. But I think the question for us in doing that together with the IOM was especially to ask the question, whose security? It's not just I tell whose security it is, but it is about, it's a conversation. Is it the security of those who are in cities and who see migrants as a threat to their security? Is it the security of the migrants? And of course it's everything, and it is a question that in itself is worth discussing and articulating, because otherwise if you don't have that conversation, you risk leaving it to more populistic voices of conversation. But then you also wanted to turn into the more solutions, and I know the L&D is a potential solution as well. But in my case, developing further the thinking and coming from UNEP, I'm also thinking whether nature-based solutions. It's kind of the technical catalogs are there. But can you use it in these contexts in a way that actually brings people together as a platform for confidence building, as a platform for bringing migrants and different vulnerable groups together? And how do you get the data of these most data silent groups together? But so I'm just thinking and hoping that nature-based solutions could be one way to get to these concrete questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and maybe just for the loss and damage, so also in the context of how much can it be a treatment rather than a Band-Aid? Like how much capacity is there to take a step back and kind of address the underlying challenges instead of it being a fund that more works to react to immediate disasters?
All right, I'll start with that, and then I'll also maybe get back to the security question from the beginning briefly. But I think the overall question is crucial, right? What type of potential do we see? It's a super important step. It's been basically already a milestone in climate processes that we now have this fund, that the decision was made, that it's so high on the climate agenda now, the topic of loss and damage. This alone was a fight for many, many years. I'm quite new to that field, but many people have really worked on this super hard for decades already. So that's in itself an important step. From my perspective, or from our perspective, having a concrete mention of human mobility in the different forms, so displacement, migration, and voluntary relocation in the decision to have this fund is already a big step, an anchor point, and therefore brings a lot of potential with the fund. So we have the framework to make sure that these issues are really being addressed by the fund, are not overshadowed or overlooked, basically, to make sure that human mobility concerns are a part of loss and damage, are interlinked with it in multiple layers, and therefore also have to be addressed when we have funding within this new instrument. Now, the step whether this potential can live up to our hopes really lies in the operationalization. I think that we have very promising signs, because even though it was very difficult discussions, not an easy negotiation environment, the decisions around setting up the fund, the administrative decisions basically that were needed now in order to actually get to the operationalization have been reached also in a timely manner, I would say, for this type of difficult negotiation context, even though I'm sure there's still points of criticism and points of concern. But I do see this as a positive sign, and I'm very hopeful that the next steps in really setting out how the fund will work, what access to funding will be possible for different groups also, including local or as much localization as possible, I'm quite hopeful that we get to a good point where this can be included. So that may be around the fund, and that would also be my hope, that it's not merely sort of a band-aid basically on the most, to reduce maybe the most grave loss and damages, but rather to really bring a change into people's lives that are so affected. I think that, though, will also rely or depend a lot on how much funding can be generated within that fund, and that's just a very difficult step. Now, very, very briefly, just the question around where does the security element come in? I think it really is in everything in the end, right? Because it's a lack of secure livelihood, secure income that leads to people having to leave. It's a lack of security when we talk about risks that people are facing when they are trapped, when they are not able to move, even though they might want to leave that area of risk. It's in the migration process itself, when we talk about the risks that come with migrating, specifically when people have to migrate in an irregular manner. So I really think this human security aspect and the lack of human security really is in every step along that nexus, basically. And the need to reach better security for the people affected should be the core whenever we tackle this issue.
And I guess then the question is, how do we enable cities as the receivers of most rural to then urban migrants also then to support in these human security elements? Tasnia, please.
I wanted to point out how a very big notion of the lack of security is fueled by the politics of being counted. So in areas where we consider, some villages to be climate vulnerable, perhaps the adjacent village is just as vulnerable, but it has been missed from that calculation. And then when you move into cities, as my colleague from New York said, when you function in informal spaces, sometimes it benefits the community to be under the radar. And in many ways, city-level government in places like Bangladesh, what the favor that they've done to these communities is to not bring attention to them in many ways, because their governance is so layered, right? So even if you look at the Loss and Damage Fund, it's such a national level conversation. And then you have C40 cities and other organizations pushing the city dynamic and bringing cities at the forefront of the conversation. But there's still so much confusion as to how much money will we get and what will we do with the money, when the problem itself is so big that many people are scared to frame it. And so that is something that I wanted to talk about, the politics of counting in terms of migration, in terms of adaptation and preparing ourselves, and how it benefits the migrants sometimes to stay in the dark. And the second one would be the communication between origin cities and the receiving cities, which is something that is missing, at least in Bangladesh. They're so consumed by the issues that are affecting them in their daily lives. They they don't have time to collaborate. And even if it was about collaboration, it almost seems like it's about responsibility shirking, where, okay, it's your problem now, you figure it out. And so some of the work that the center that I represent does with the Asia Foundation is we look at borderlands, and we're looking at Bangladesh and India borderlands, where the notion of security and climate change is a big one, but it's also subtle, where year-long structural violence has really shaped how the adaptability of climate-affected households. And so these questions are obviously broader and more difficult to ask, and there's a lack of political will to sort of see it from this angle. But again, like many other colleagues have mentioned, we have to sort of exercise all the lens that we have to find a holistic answer to this. And again, bringing back to the point that I mentioned and my colleague mentioned about agency, is there really a choice being given to these households to remain or walk away? Thank you.
Yeah, maybe to build on that with an example of the case study from Ghana, outlining that any approach need to, in order to support the activities on the climate migration nexus, need to center on creating triple wins for the sending area, for the receiving area, and for the migrants on the move. And I think that is, as you outlined, the challenge, and Christina, you also referred to this, the role of planning with the different trends that we are facing here, that there is a vertical linkage between the local and the national planning, and we are talking, for example, about loss and damage, but we're also talking about countries currently still in the need to pass in national adaptation plans. And this, I think, will be the basis also for improved access to different funding sources. So we're getting back to this urban planning, to the to those planning capacities on the ground, to the improvement of bringing in the local level into this overall, or into this processes, and also to strengthen the capacities to make it a key part of the actual vulnerability and risk assessment informing these kind of adaptation plannings. And I think that is a starting point, I think it's a key of this triple win strategy that outlined in one country and probably valid for the other countries as well. Thanks.
If I may, from sort of a conflict prevention, stabilization lens on this issue, the one thing we haven't been talking about as much in depth, and I think is actually central to this conversation, is sort of governance and institutions and their ability to absorb, weather, bounce back from shocks, and the ability for those institutions to be responsive to different citizens that may be in precarious or vulnerable situations, right? I think what climate migration does is sort of upend a couple of things. One is, it shifts sort of temporally and spatially where and how people are moving, right? So this is why we have this urban focus right now in this conversation, because we assume that much of the migration will be rural to urban in urban centers. But you know, aside from that, it's like, where in the urban center are they moving? And to Dennis's point earlier, or your point earlier, actually from the UN's point of view, who are they interacting with, right? Are they being provided with basic services when they are received in that community, right? And so I think overall, just sort of strengthening the ability of governments to respond to shocks and also be inclusive and sort of create these sort of longer term plans with migrants in mind and migrants participating is a central part, a central component of some of this work.
So my name is Tegan Blaine, and I'm at the U.S. Institute of Peace. One of the things that we're thinking about just in terms of solutions is how bringing more of a peace-building lens to the urban issues might be useful, and how can the climate change community learn from that. And so we have recently supported some work thinking about what it actually means to build cities that can absorb migrant populations, for example, and what that means in terms of thinking about municipal areas there are often multiple governments thinking about the institutions that work with people, both formal and informal institutions, and how you bring together this very diverse landscape to think about some of the problems in a more integrated way. I also really appreciated your comment about those borderland areas, and we are beginning to fund some research specifically on secondary cities in borderland areas and how they're beginning to respond to some of these issues as well, because oftentimes we're talking about some of the major cities, but some of the secondary cities is some of the areas that are receiving as well, which have fewer resources, fewer capacity to deal with these issues. I don't want to see ignored. But then lastly, I would say we have kind of skirted around this issue about immobile populations and their experience. And some of those people may be there because they're stuck. Some of those people may be choosing to stay. And especially when it comes to security issues, as more people are moving out of rural areas, it's really shifting the dynamics of the communities that are staying behind, whether by choice or by the fact that they don't have any other options. And so that is an area that we are looking to better understand how those communities are changing, what that means about the risk of conflict in communities that are losing a lot of the capacity, a lot of leadership, are losing businesses or losing access to schools or medical centers that can no longer be supported by the existing population. And so we're beginning to look at, what is the actual experience and the risks of conflict in those areas. And then lastly, I would say, kind of along with the experience of people who are staying behind, we're also beginning to look at some of the intangibles of climate change and how increased heat, how climate-related traumas are beginning to affect people, especially in urban areas, and how that fits into decisions that they're making about whether to go, whether to stay, and what their life looks like in those areas. So I just wanted to throw out a couple of things that we're thinking about and worrying about, especially from more of a peace and conflict lens as we're thinking about the complexity of these issues.
Thank you. Also for bringing that perspective of the people in the areas of origin, also going back to Dennis's point on the triple win and making sure that we take this translocal perspective also when we do policy planning for urban areas, whether that means, okay, how do we facilitate then remittances and where does this go, and ensuring those structures as well. I want to go back to one point on strengthening the ability of government, to respond to shock, but first I promised Nora the word, so please. Oh. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm Nora, I'm from the International Water Management Institute, which is part of the CGIAR, and I'm based in South Africa, and I work across East and Southern Africa, and find the discussion the whole day very interesting, but particularly in urban settings, the private sector and the commodification of services is really quite critical, because the government actually cannot keep up with, basic water delivery. In many cases, the government's already struggling, and now you have, within 2 weeks, a whole new informal settlement. And so I find working, and kind of no one has mentioned the private sector, even though they are so critical for introducing any sort of stability to communities. They basically fill the vacuum that's often left. So we are trying to work with, and we're sort of at the beginning, so I'm not going to give you a grand conclusion, but how do we scale private sector? How do we actually support the private sector? Because I think it's not feasible in many cases to expect the public sector to jump into those spaces at the pace that is required. And as quickly as these settlements pop up, disappear, move, these are extremely transient situations, particularly in cities, I would say. So I just wanted to bring that in, because we talk a lot about governments, but for me there is a big question where the private sector fits into it, and how we can actually, as an international community, support extremely difficult, informal, often, the businesses themselves are as transient as the populations, obviously, that they are in. So it's a very difficult environment. Thanks.
Thank you. So we just have 4 minutes left now. So if there's any final specific thoughts on how do we support the resiliency of institutions, what can we do to better support local governments in dealing with these challenges, whether that's then also facilitating partnerships with the private sector or better integrating civil society or, yeah. Now we're getting to the solutions and everyone is averting their gaze. No one wants to look. Please.
Maybe just a kind of broad thought. I think one thing that the sort of global community can do is help shift the narrative from this is for us to grow and meet the challenges of climate change, and help planners in our countries and our cities take that approach that, you know, we're taking positive forward action about a changing world. The world is changing. If we get ahead of this, if we plan for it, it can be a good thing.
Hello, my name is Patricia Albrecht. I'm a climate affairs advisor at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So also talking about the security angle. So we're also planning an initiative in Southeastern Europe, also on hopefully providing more research and data on how human mobility, climate change, and security are interlinked. And we're also aiming to foster cooperation and providing a platform for the relevant stakeholders to come together, because yeah, this is like the aim of our project to build these networks, and hopefully this will also help to build resilience and also provide visibility for communities and stakeholders to bring up the topics and then jointly address the challenges. So yeah, hopefully next year around this time we will have the first results. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's critical issue how to support the public institutions, especially in conflict areas where it is more difficult. And one of the things I think it would help a lot is to work through these public institutions, because nowadays, for example, in conflict areas, most of the work are being made by the international organizations. And for example, in Yemen, now even the responsibilities which was made by the public institutions, they are now being made by the international communities. So you can imagine if the war stopped tomorrow, the public institutions will face a lot of problems, not only in the sustainability of the systems itself, but also in the human capacities, because now the experts who are working with the institutions, public institutions, move to work with the international organizations because of the economic situations, lack of salaries. So it is a catastrophic. I mean, if the war stopped, if the conflict stopped. I mean, it is a problem even in stable situations, and you can imagine how it is difficult during the conflict situation. Thank you.
Sabine, please.
Yeah, one last comment, and I mean, we know it's a matter of fact that there is a huge lack of in the justice of distribution of adaptation finance. Countries like Yemen have no access to adaptation finance, for example. Also, like other countries in fragile situations, and that is a massive problem that needs to be regulated. The distribution of German climate finance is a little bit better than the rest of the world. But still, I mean, there is a lot of room to improve this situation, that especially those countries with the highest climate risk in fragile context have least, they are actually discriminated by the access to adaptation finance. Thank you.
Tasnia, final word.
Yeah, just a point on how collaboration is very, very important, yes. But like my colleague from Yemen said, it cannot be used to outsource government responsibility, which is what sometimes happens. And especially in formal settlements where migrants live, private companies have, you know, they need to be sort of, you know, reviewed on whether their practices of engagement with informal communities are ethical or not. And often there are these very big caveats that we need to be aware of. And definitely, like, for example, UNDP does wonderful work in the informal settlements, helps the government sort of not recognize informality, but at the same time ensures, very critical services reaching migrant communities. So absolutely collaboration is the way, but very strict on, governments not to use these collaborations. It's just, this is not my problem. I'm going to outsource it.
Okay, thank you so much. So we're at time. My colleagues taking notes have the impossible task of tying all this together. It's a big discussion with lots of different points. I think maybe importantly, to go back to what Minister Baerbock said, is to make sure that no matter what, that we approach it in an integrated, specific and anticipatory way. And looking forward to seeing how this all is put together in the summary and then sharing that with all of you. And thank you so much to all our speakers and to everybody else who participated and listened in the discussion. Thank you.